In the summer of 2001, crews in Central Florida did something that looked on the surface like a mistake. They filled in a canal. Not a small drainage ditch, a federally built waterway 30 feet deep and 300 feet wide, running 60 miles across the state's interior. They brought in excavators, moved millions of cubic yards of material back into the cut, and let the water find somewhere else to go. It found the old channels, the ones the canal had been built to replace. Within 2 growing seasons, native grasses that nobody had planted were spreading across ground that had been dry for 30 years. Within 3 years, wading birds were nesting along the restored stretch in numbers that hadn't been recorded there since before the canal was built. The floodplain, given back the water it had been cut off from, did not wait for instructions. This is the story of Florida's Kissimmee River. What engineers did to it, why it seemed like the right call at the time, and what happened when they tried to reverse it. The Kissimmee River in the 1940s was not a dramatic river. It moved slowly through about 103 miles of central Florida, bending and curving across a flat landscape in long, unhurried loops. Its floodplain, the low ground that flooded with the seasonal rains, stretched up to 2 miles wide in places and covered tens of thousands of acres of marsh and wet prairie. That floodplain was the engine of the entire downstream system. When the Kissimmee overflowed its banks each wet season, fish moved into the shallow grass to feed and spawn. Wading birds followed the fish. Herons, egrets, ibises, and wood-storks gathered in concentrations that historical accounts describe as darkening the sky above the marsh. The river supported one of the highest densities of nesting wading birds anywhere in North America. The flooding also cleaned the water. As the river spread slowly across the floodplain, native vegetation filtered phosphorus and nitrogen out of the flow. Sediment settled out of suspension. Dissolved oxygen increased as the water moved through grass and root systems rather than a single deep channel. What the river delivered to the land came back measurably cleaner than it arrived. That filtered water moved south to Lake Okeechobee, which fed the vast shallow system that became the Everglades. The Kissimmee was the headwaters of the most ecologically distinctive water system in the eastern United States. Its function depended entirely on water moving slowly, sideways through the floodplain, and that slowness depended on the river bending. By the early 1950s, Central Florida was growing faster than its floodplains could accommodate. Farmers were expanding onto low-lying land. Housing developments were being platted across terrain that flooded every wet season. The Kissimmee River, doing exactly what it had always done, was becoming a problem for a state that needed buildable, farmable ground. In 1960, Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to solve it. The solution was straightforward by the engineering standards of the time. Replace the meandering river with a straight canal. The C-38 canal would carry water south to Lake Okeechobee efficiently, predictably, and without the seasonal overflow that made the river's floodplain both ecologically essential and agriculturally inconvenient. Construction began in 1962 and was complete by 1971. 56 miles of engineered channel had replaced 103 miles of river. The original floodplain was largely drained. The project cost approximately $32 million and was considered an engineering success. The monitoring data told a different story. A straight channel does not do what a meandering river does. When a river bends, water on the outside of each curve moves faster than water on the inside. That difference generates spiral circulation. The water picks up sediment in some places and deposits it in others, and the river gradually adjusts its own shape through that continuous erosion and deposition. A meandering river is always rebuilding itself. Bends also slow the water down. The energy that would otherwise cut into the channel floor is dissipated through friction and turbulence around each curve. During high rainfall, that friction is what allows water to spill sideways across the floodplain rather than surging straight through and delivering everything downstream at once. The C-38 canal removed all of that. Water moved south in roughly half the distance in half the time. Flood pulses that had once spread across miles of shallow wetland now moved up and down within the canal's engineered banks. The floodplain, cut off from the water that had structured it for thousands of years, began to dry out. The consequences tracked the water loss. Within a decade of the canal's completion, wading bird populations in the Kissimmee floodplain had fallen by approximately 90%, according to surveys conducted by Florida fish and wildlife agencies. Largemouth bass populations dropped by roughly three-quarters. The wetland vegetation that had filtered the river's nutrient load before it reached Lake Okeechobee was no longer functioning. The floodplain soils, exposed to air where they had previously been seasonally saturated, were now releasing the nutrients they had stored. The canal was delivering water to Lake Okeechobee faster than the original river ever had. But the water it delivered was carrying more phosphorus and nitrogen than the river's floodplain had ever allowed to pass. Lake Okeechobee began showing the results. Algal blooms grew more frequent. Submerged aquatic vegetation collapsed in sections of the lake. The downstream effects moved toward the Everglades, compounding problems that were already developing from other sources. It had taken 9 years to build the canal. Within another decade, the damage was measurable from multiple directions at once. Through the 1970s and 1980s, researchers at the South Florida Water Management District began systematically connecting the monitoring data to the hydrology. A district ecologist named Louis Toth spent years building the scientific case for reversal, compiling the evidence, documenting the mechanisms, and framing the argument in terms that water managers and legislators could act on. The argument was not based on sentiment. It was hydrological. The canal was costing the state in measurable ways: degraded fisheries, lost water filtration function, accelerating water quality problems in a lake that fed a national park. The case for restoring the river was, in significant part, an economic and hydrological case. Congress authorised a restoration feasibility study in 1992. The central question was whether a canal built with federal money could actually become a river again, and whether the ecosystem, damaged for more than 2 decades, would respond if it did. Before committing to the answer at full scale, engineers proposed a test. In 1994, a single section of the C-38 canal was plugged. Water was blocked from flowing through that portion of the canal and redirected into the adjacent historic channel, the original Kissimmee riverbed, which had been sitting dry since the early 1970s. What the demonstration project found changed the terms of the conversation. The historic channel had not lost its shape. Water found it and followed it. Within 2 growing seasons, native floodplain plants, maiden cane, pickerel weed, and arrowhead were establishing themselves across the reconnected floodplain without any planning program. Wading bird density in the restored stretch climbed measurably higher than in the unrestored canal sections immediately adjacent. Dissolved oxygen levels improved. The soil was cycling nutrients and supporting invertebrate communities that had been absent for more than 2 decades. The floodplain was responding to the water, not waiting to be managed. The demonstration project ran through 1999. By the time it concluded, the monitoring record had established one specific and consequential finding: the ecological memory of the floodplain, the seed banks in the soil, the dormant root systems. The channel geometry etched into the landform had survived more than 2 decades of suppression without disappearing. The question was no longer whether the ecosystem could recover. The question was how much of it remained recoverable at full scale. Full construction began in 2001. Over the following decade, crews filled in approximately 35 miles of the C-38 canal, section by section, using the spoil material that had originally been excavated to build it. As each segment was blocked, water moved back into historic channels that engineers had identified from aerial photography, old survey maps, and field surveys. The historic channels were still there. 30 years of drying had colonized them with upland vegetation, but their basic geometry, the curves, the pools, the shallow crossings, was intact in the landscape. The river had been suppressed. It had not been erased. Restoration engineers were not trying to reconstruct the exact Kissimmee that had existed in 1960. The goal was to re-establish the physical conditions that made the river function. Bends that would slow and spread the water, channels that would reconnect to the floodplain during high flows, banks that could shift as the water resumed its normal behaviour. Once those conditions were in place, most of the rest followed on its own. The monitoring data from restored sections of the Kissimmee documents a specific recovery. Floodplain wetland coverage in restored areas increased from less than 10% of historic extent, measured under full canal conditions, to more than 75% within the first several years after water was reintroduced in each section. That vegetation returned without active planting programs. It was driven by the restored flood pulse reconnecting the river to ground it had been separated from for decades. Fish populations in restored sections were measurably higher than in adjacent unrestored canal sections across multiple species. Wading bird populations increased substantially. Some species in restored areas showed population increases of 300% or more relative to baseline measurements taken under canal conditions, though figures varied by species and monitoring period. Dissolved oxygen improved. Invertebrate communities rebounded. The river itself began what geomorphologists call meander migration, the gradual lateral shifting of a channel through erosion and deposition. That is how rivers naturally maintain and adjust their own geometry over time. The Kissimmee, given material to work with and banks that could move, was beginning to rebuild itself. Not everything returned at the pace models had predicted. Some species recovered faster than expected, others more slowly or incompletely. The margins of the restored floodplain remained contested in places where land had been in private agricultural ownership since the canal was built, and where questions about restoration boundaries were not resolved by hydrology alone. The restoration cost approximately $578 million across its primary phases, funded jointly by federal and state agencies. It recovered roughly 44 miles of river channel and an estimated 27,000 acres of wetland. Those numbers carry a specific limitation. The original Kissimmee floodplain covered approximately 35,000 acres. The restoration returned a substantial portion of it, but about one-third of the original canal remains in place, partly because of property constraints, partly because some sections still serve drainage functions that were never rerouted. The canal that damaged the system was not entirely removed. Downstream, Lake Okeechobee continues to experience severe algal blooms driven by agricultural runoff from sources well beyond the Kissimmee watershed. The Everglades remains one of the most hydrologically stressed ecosystems in North America. The Kissimmee restoration was designed as one component of a much larger effort, and the components that have not been completed still matter. What the Kissimmee project demonstrated, specifically and measurably, is that a floodplain can recover when the physical mechanism that sustained it is restored. It did not prove that ecosystems are infinitely resilient. It proved something more specific and more useful, that a river deprived of its bends for more than 30 years had not lost what it needed to function. When given the conditions, it functioned. That finding carried well beyond Florida. Since the Kissimmee began producing documented results, the concept that rivers carry their own geometric and biological logic, and will express it when physical constraints are removed, has informed restoration work across North America and Europe. The Skjern River in Denmark, channelized in the 1960s and restored beginning in 2002, produced comparable results within a few years. Measurable improvements in fish populations, floodplain wetland coverage, and water quality. Smaller projects in England, Germany, and the American West have applied versions of the same principle: restore the conditions, then observe. The principle does not apply universally. Not every river recovers on the same timeline. Not every drained floodplain retains an intact seed bank after decades of suppression. Not every historic channel holds recoverable geometry. The variables are numerous and site-specific, and the Kissimmee's results cannot be treated as guarantees elsewhere. But what the Kissimmee established, at a scale large enough to be scientifically meaningful, is that the information encoded in a river system, the channel memory, the biological seed stock, the hydrological relationships, can survive decades of disruption without disappearing. It waits. Today, the restored sections of the Kissimmee move through a floodplain that looks, from above, something like the one documented in mid-century surveys. Long curves, connected marshes, birds working the shallows in concentrations not recorded there in 50 years. Monitoring continues. Some of what the restoration produced remains below what pre-channelization surveys recorded. Some ecological relationships that once existed in the system may have been simplified in ways that will take further decades to assess. The river is functional and measurably recovering. Whether it is fully restored is a question the available data does not yet answer. What the project established in concrete terms is that returning a river's bends is not a symbolic gesture. It is a mechanical intervention with documented ecological consequences. And when those consequences include a floodplain waking up, vegetation returning without planning, birds returning without reintroduction, the river rebuilding its own geometry through normal erosion. What you are watching is not something being created from nothing. You are watching something that was always there, given permission to surface again.